Hi, so today I will be focusing on how to be an anti-racist. I think last week I messed the chapter up because I think I was looking at the unupdated one. So I don't think I talked about body at all. So this week, the chapter I'm going to be focusing on is body. So I just downloaded an audiobook and I found it a lot easier to listen to it than read it, especially after we had the forum, just because it reminded me a lot of the way that he relayed information in the forum. So, just like another way to get the same media. But so I listened to Body, and a couple of the quotes that stood out to me are just facts. So one of the facts that I thought was really interesting was that white people see black bodies as larger and potentially more harmful, and then he later goes on to say, and more likely to require force to control, and he cites slavery. He cites police violence. He cites lynching, things like that. It's something that so many of us have almost completely subconsciously ingrained inside our brains. And it almost ends up being this like self-fulfilling prophecy, because when you're afraid of somebody, you treat them more like an animal, which is what he was talking about in, like, at the very beginning of the chapter. The quote says what it's like to be an anti-racist looking at bodies, and what it's like to be a racist looking at bodies. And so many of us are unconsciously racist towards bodies that don't look like ours. And so I just, that's something that I do, and I'm ashamed to say that I do it, but it's also a good step for me to be able to say that I do it. An interesting thing was at the very end of the chapter when he says, "We are not taught to fear good white men with AR-15s, but we are taught to fear the weary, unarmed Latinx body, the Arab body, the black body," and he says the black body from hell. I was just talking to Dr. Dorothy Chan about what it's like to be a male black body in America, and she cited this study about they interviewed Latinx men and women. They interviewed Asian men and women. They interviewed Indigenous men and women, and they interviewed black men and black women. And the question and white men and women, but that's a little beside the point. But they asked all the women of each racial group, if you will. They asked each woman from each group if they could, would they change, do you think that the opposite gender sex has it easier? And every single group of people, the women said yes, except for the black women. The black women said, they acknowledged that being a black woman in America is very difficult, but they didn't believe that it was any more or less difficult than being a black man, just because of the way that black men have been targeted, and black men are seen as, like, their bodies are seen as larger. Their bodies are seen as the black body from hell. And so that's the first thing that I thought of when I heard this chapter. Just, how targeted these larger black male bodies are, armed or unarmed. And that study just stood out to me because I think that every single white woman, if given the chance, if what they were asked a question about, like, if you were to be a white man instead, would you be safer? I think every single white woman would say yes. You know, and that just really proves that the African American or Black populations in America aren't safe as any sex, any gender, because of their bodies. I also really liked, well, I didn't like, but I really benefited from the piece where he talks about the history. I always like when he goes into history. But he says that history tells the same story, and he cites Bill Clinton, and he talks about how Bill Clinton said that blacks must understand and acknowledge the roots of white fear in America. But then the chapter goes on to talk about all of these reasons that black people and black populations should fear white people, not the opposite. You know, he talks about Captain John Smith and how they told white people to fear black bodies. He cited the phrase ruthless savages when talking about black folks and when talking about indigenous folks. You know, that seems to be like white people's favorite thing to call indigenous folks. I'm a TA for an American Indian literature class right now, and there are a few white cis males that really are not afraid to talk about how obscure and insane and disgusting some of the things that we're talking about in this literature is, and how the Europeans did it better. And the Europeans were more advanced, and this is archaic, and, you know, and so that reminded me of that, just because, you know, I've had to have these difficult conversations when they come into my office hours and they say, you know, like, this tradition doesn't make sense, you know, and all I can really say is I know it doesn't, because it's not your culture. And so that's a lot of the same underlying issue that's happening here, is culture is getting skewed and portrayed incorrectly, and it really, you know, what he's saying is it really started as early as Captain John Smith. You know, that's a perfect example. He walked into a culture that didn't belong to him. It's like Indiana Jones. He walked into a culture that didn't belong to him. He saw what they were doing, and he looked through a window. You know, like, that's not, you know, when you're talking about windows, mirrors, sliding glass doors, there's also the idea that, there's also a new idea that cultures have every right to pull the blinds on those windows. And, you know, Captain John Smith is a perfect example of why people should be closing, you know, these blinds from white folks, because they construe everything. So yeah, I really enjoyed this chapter. I found it very applicable to some of the racism that I hold within myself, but also a lot of the literature that I've been reading recently. And I'm hoping that I'm able to translate what I read from this chapter into the texts of different cultures, like the Lakota Dakota chapters of my textbook that I've been reading. So yes, so next I'm going to do my video on the actual forum itself. So more to come. Thank you.